On a cold October night in 1968, in a basement gym beneath the streets of downtown Los Angeles, two men would face each other in what witnesses would later describe as the most terrifying display of human capability they had ever seen. One was a Soviet powerlifter whose name has been erased from every official record. The other was Bruce Lee. What happened that night would challenge everything we thought we knew about the limits of human strength and the power of human consciousness. This is the story of the night Bruce Lee met the unbreakable man. The world was fracturing along ideological lines. Above ground, America and the Soviet Union waged their Cold War through proxy conflicts and space races. But beneath the surface, in the shadows of major cities, another kind of competition was taking place. The basement of Murphy's Athletic Club on Spring Street wasn't just a gym. It was a testing ground, a place where the Soviet Union's most experimental athletes came to prove that communist science could create superior human beings. The man they sent had no official name in any document. Witnesses would only remember him as Viktor, 6 feet 8 inches tall, 437 pounds of pure muscle. And according to the classified reports that would surface decades later, he was the product of something called Project Prometheus, a Soviet program designed to push human strength beyond biological limits. Viktor could break concrete with his bare hands. He could deadlift over 900 pounds without breaking a sweat. Soviet scientists had been studying him for 3 years, trying to understand how his nervous system could coordinate such massive force output. On the other side of the world, literally and philosophically, Bruce Lee was developing something entirely different. While the Soviets were building their human tank, Lee was becoming something more elegant, more dangerous. Lee weighed 135 pounds. Viktor weighed over 400. But weight, as Bruce Lee would prove that night, was just one variable in a much more complex equation. October 15th, 11:47 p.m. The challenge came through channels that no longer exist. A phone call from someone who claimed to represent interested parties in the Soviet athletic program. The voice spoke perfect English with no accent. "Mr. Lee, we have someone we'd like you to meet. Someone who represents the pinnacle of human physical development. Are you interested in a scientific exchange?" Lee had been training for exactly this kind of encounter his entire life. Not a fight. Not a competition. A laboratory experiment in the physics of human conflict. When Viktor entered Murphy's basement, the temperature seemed to drop. Not from cold, but from the sheer density of his presence. He moved like a glacier, inevitable, unstoppable, carrying the weight of geological time. The witnesses that night would later struggle to articulate what they saw. It wasn't just the size difference. It was like watching two different species of human being occupying the same space. And in that moment of recognition, something shifted. Two philosophies of human potential were about to collide. To understand what happened that night, we need to understand the science of force production. And more importantly, why raw strength isn't always the deciding factor in human conflict. Viktor's strength came from hypertrophy, the systematic enlargement of muscle fibers through progressive overload. Soviet sports science had perfected this process. They fed their athletes a diet of 8,000 calories per day, subjected them to training volumes that would hospitalize normal humans, and monitored every biological marker. The result was a human being who could generate force levels that bordered on the supernatural. Viktor's grip strength was measured at 275 pounds per square inch, enough to crush a bowling ball, but force without speed is just pressure, and pressure without timing is just noise. Bruce Lee's approach to force generation was fundamentally different. Where Viktor built bigger engines, Lee built better computers. His nervous system had been rewired through decades of precise training to coordinate multiple muscle groups into perfect synchrony. Neuroscientists studying martial artists have discovered something remarkable. The brains of expert fighters show increased white matter density in regions controlling motor coordination. They don't just move faster, they think movement faster. Viktor's strength was linear. More weight, more resistance, more force applied directly through the mechanical advantage of bone leverage. Lee's strength was exponential. Small inputs creating massive outputs through the cascading effect of perfect timing. Think of a whip. The handle barely moves, but the tip breaks the sound barrier. Bruce Lee had turned his entire body into a whip. Viktor had turned his body into a sledgehammer. In that basement, on that October night, these two approaches to human capability were about to be tested under the most honest conditions possible. No rules, no referees, just the laws of physics, and the question of which man understood them better. Viktor began his demonstration the way Soviet athletes always did, with methodical precision. He approached a concrete block that had been placed in the center of the gym, 18 inches square, 6 inches thick. Standard construction-grade concrete, cured for 60 days. The block disintegrated, not cracked, not broken, disintegrated, into chunks no larger than gravel. Viktor's knuckles showed no damage, no swelling, no blood. His breathing hadn't even changed. What Viktor had just demonstrated violated several principles of human biomechanics. The human hand contains 27 bones, none of them designed to impact solid concrete without catastrophic damage. Yet Viktor's hand was anatomically intact. Later analysis would reveal that Viktor's bone density was beyond normal human parameters. Soviet scientists had somehow altered his skeletal structure through a combination of pharmaceutical intervention and mechanical stress adaptation. His bones had become living weapons. But Bruce Lee wasn't looking at Viktor's hand. He wasn't even looking at the destroyed concrete. He was watching something else entirely. "Show me again," Lee said quietly. Viktor obliged. Same result. The concrete exploded into fragments, but this time, Bruce Lee was watching Viktor's entire body, not just the impact point. What Lee observed was revealing. Viktor's power was absolute, but it was also completely committed. Every strike was maximum force, maximum energy expenditure. There was no subtlety, no variation, no conservation of energy. Viktor moved like a siege engine, devastating when it hit, but requiring significant time to reload and reposition. Lee recognized this pattern from his studies of mechanical systems. "My turn," Lee said. But instead of approaching a concrete block, he simply stood in place and extended his right arm toward Viktor's chest. What happened next would take 43 years to fully understand. In 2011, researchers at Tufts University's Biomechanics Laboratory would use high-speed cameras and force sensors to analyze Bruce Lee's one-inch punch technique. What they discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about human force production. The one-inch punch isn't actually generated by the arm. It's generated by a kinetic chain that begins in the feet, travels through the legs, rotates through the hips, amplifies through the torso, and finally expresses through the arm. But the key, the secret Viktor was about to learn, was in the timing. Lee's nervous system could coordinate this entire sequence in 0.15 seconds, faster than most people could even perceive movement. But more importantly, he could turn it on and off like a light switch. No wind-up, no commitment, no tell. Viktor flew backward 18 feet. Not pushed, not shoved, launched. like he'd been hit by an invisible freight train. But here's what separated this from every other demonstration of Bruce Lee's power. Viktor landed safely. Lee had calculated the exact force needed to move Viktor's mass across the room without causing injury. The power was precise, controlled, surgical. Viktor's response was predictable. He charged. When a 437-pound man decides to run directly at you, physics says you have two options: get out of the way or get crushed. Bruce Lee chose a third option that physics hadn't accounted for. Lee moved exactly 18 inches to his right. Not 17, not 19, 18. The precise minimum distance required for Viktor's momentum to carry him past without contact. But Lee wasn't finished with his physics lesson. As Viktor passed, Lee touched his shoulder. Not a strike, not a push, a redirect. Like a matador with a bull, except the matador was changing the laws of motion. Viktor crashed into a stack of weight plates with the sound of an artillery shell. 300 pounds of iron scattered across the concrete floor like children's toys. Viktor's second attempt was more calculated. He approached slowly, using his reach advantage, throwing controlled jabs designed to overwhelm Lee's defensive capability through sheer volume. Each of Viktor's punches carried approximately 2,800 pounds of force. By comparison, heavyweight champion Muhammad Ali's most powerful recorded punch generated 1,400 pounds. Viktor was throwing twice that power, repeatedly, without apparent fatigue. But here's what the witnesses described as impossible. Lee wasn't just avoiding the punches, he was predicting them. Lee was reading Viktor's nervous system. Every punch begins as an electrical signal in the brain. That signal travels down the spinal cord, activates the shoulder muscles, then the arm muscles. Lee was seeing Viktor's punches before Viktor's own muscles knew they were coming. The average reaction time to a visual stimulus is 0.25 seconds. Lee was responding to Viktor's punches in 0.08 seconds, faster than should be neurologically possible, unless he wasn't reacting to what he saw, unless he was reading what was about to happen. Lee's counterattack was surgical. He didn't attack Viktor's muscles. He attacked Viktor's nervous system. What Bruce Lee understood, and what Soviet sports science had overlooked, was that strength has a critical vulnerability. The stronger you become, the more dependent you become on your nervous system's ability to coordinate that strength. Think of it this way. Controlling 400 pounds of muscle is like conducting an orchestra of 400 musicians. The more musicians you add, the more complex the coordination becomes, and the easier it becomes to disrupt the entire performance by interrupting the conductor. Lee struck 3 pressure points in rapid succession, not to cause pain, not to cause damage, to cause confusion. Viktor's right arm stopped working, not because Lee had damaged the muscle, but because he had interrupted the nerve signals controlling that muscle. 200 pounds of perfectly developed muscle mass, suddenly as useless as dead weight. "What did you do?" Viktor asked, in accented English. His voice carried a note of something Soviet athletes weren't supposed to feel. Fear. "I turned off your computer," Lee replied. "Your muscles are just the hardware. I accessed your software." The paralysis was temporary. The nerve signals would restore themselves within minutes. But those minutes were enough to demonstrate something profound. In human conflict, consciousness trumps muscle mass. But here was the twist that would stay with witnesses for decades. Bruce Lee could have done anything in that moment. Viktor was helpless, unbalanced, confused. Lee could have destroyed him. Instead, he waited. He watched Viktor's arm slowly regain function. watched the confusion clear from the giant's eyes, watched understanding dawn. Viktor had spent his entire adult life being the strongest person in every room. He had been conditioned to believe that strength was the answer to every physical question. In 30 seconds, Bruce Lee had shown him a question that strength couldn't answer. Viktor's final attack came not from anger, but from desperation. He had been programmed to win, and every algorithm he'd been given was failing. When pure muscle failed, Viktor reached for force multiplication. He grabbed a 45-pound weight plate, holding it like a discus. The plate became a projectile weapon, 45 pounds of cast iron thrown with 437 pounds of muscle behind it. The plate spun through the air at roughly 60 miles per hour. At that velocity, with that mass, it carried enough kinetic energy to shatter bones on impact. What happened next violated every survival instinct known to human psychology. Instead of moving away from the threat, Lee moved toward it. Lee caught the plate. Not with both hands, not with a defensive position. With one hand, as casually as catching a frisbee in the park. The physics of this moment were impossible by conventional understanding. Catching a 45-pound object moving at 60 miles per hour requires absorbing roughly 800 pounds of force instantly. Lee's arm should have shattered. But Lee didn't absorb the force. He redirected it. His hand made contact with the plate's edge, not its center, allowing the rotational energy to dissipate through controlled spin rather than direct impact. The force flowed through his arm, his shoulder, his torso, and into the ground. He set the plate down gently, as if it were made of glass, and in that moment, Viktor understood something that would change the trajectory of Soviet sports science forever. Strength without control wasn't power. It was just noise. How? Viktor asked. Not angry anymore. Curious. Like a student who just discovered that everything he thought he knew about mathematics was wrong. You've been training your muscles to be strong, Lee said. I've been training my nervous system to be conscious. The encounter lasted 37 minutes. Viktor would return to the Soviet Union 3 days later, carrying with him a classified report that would fundamentally alter how the communist sports program understood human potential. Within 2 years, Soviet training protocols would begin incorporating what they called neural efficiency training, exercises designed not to build bigger muscles, but to build better communication between the brain and the muscles that already existed. Viktor himself would become one of the Soviet Union's most innovative training coaches, developing methods that prioritized control over raw power, precision over maximum force output. Bruce Lee learned something equally valuable that night. He discovered that true strength isn't about what you can break. It's about what you can choose not to break. Those hands had just demonstrated that they could redirect 800 pounds of kinetic energy without injury to anyone. The restraint required for that level of control was more impressive than any display of destructive power. The broken concrete would be swept up the next morning. The scattered weights would be restacked. The basement would return to being just another gym where men lifted heavy things and put them down again. But the lesson would endure. In the equation of human potential, consciousness is the most powerful variable. Strength without control is just noise. But strength with consciousness, that's the sound of human evolution. That night in October 1968, in a basement beneath Los Angeles, 2 men discovered that the limits of human capability aren't determined by how much force you can generate, but by how precisely you can control the force you already have. The strongest man in the world had met the most conscious man in the world, and consciousness won. What wasn't known until decades later was that Viktor's presence in Los Angeles wasn't random. Declassified KGB documents from 1991 revealed that Project Prometheus had been tracking Bruce Lee since his demonstrations at the 1964 Long Beach International Karate Championships. Soviet sports scientists had been particularly intrigued by reports of Lee's one-inch punch, a technique that seemed to violate their understanding of biomechanics. They had calculated that generating such force from such a short distance should be physically impossible given Lee's relatively modest muscle mass. Dr. Alexei Volkov, the lead researcher on Project Prometheus, had written in his classified report, "The American subject appears to have developed neural pathways that we have not yet replicated in our enhanced athletes. His force-to-mass ratio suggests unknown variables in human performance optimization." Viktor was their test case, their ultimate measuring stick. If their artificially enhanced super soldier could not defeat this natural anomaly, then Soviet sports science needed a fundamental paradigm shift. The basement encounter was never intended to be a fight. It was a live laboratory experiment, with Viktor serving as both subject and instrument of measurement. What the Soviets failed to understand was that Bruce Lee's power didn't come from any single physical attribute. It came from something they couldn't measure, replicate, or enhance through chemical intervention. Neuroplasticity taken to its absolute extreme. Lee's training methods, which he had developed through years of obsessive experimentation, had literally rewired his brain's motor cortex. While Viktor's enhanced physique represented the limits of what external manipulation could achieve, Lee represented the limits of what internal optimization could accomplish. The key difference lay in their approach to muscle fiber recruitment. Normal humans can only activate about 30% of their muscle fibers during maximum effort. Elite athletes might reach 40%. Viktor, through pharmaceutical enhancement, could reach 60%. Bruce Lee could activate 85%. This wasn't because of steroids or genetic manipulation. It was because he had trained his nervous system to overcome the natural inhibition mechanisms that prevent humans from using their full strength. Most of these inhibitions exist as protective measures. Using 100% of muscle capacity would tear tendons and shatter bones. Lee had found the precise balance point, maximum activation without self-destruction. What witnesses didn't understand was the psychological toll of what they had observed. Viktor returned to Moscow carrying more than just a classified report. He carried the weight of having his entire worldview shattered in 37 minutes. Soviet athletes were conditioned to believe in the supremacy of their scientific approach. They were told they represented the pinnacle of human development, that capitalist athletes were inferior products of a flawed system. Viktor had been the strongest, most enhanced specimen the Soviet Union had ever produced, and he had been rendered helpless by a 135-pound actor who trained alone in a garage. The psychological damage was profound. Viktor would later tell his training partners that facing Bruce Lee was like trying to fight mathematics itself. Every physical law he understood had been turned against him with surgical precision. This psychological impact would ripple through the entire Soviet sports program. If their ultimate warrior could be defeated so decisively, what did that say about their understanding of human potential? The basement encounter would influence athletic training for decades to come. The Soviet report on Viktor's performance led to revolutionary changes in how they understood the relationship between mind and muscle. By 1970, Soviet training facilities began incorporating meditation, visualization, and neural feedback training into their programs. They started studying Eastern philosophy, not for spiritual reasons, but for performance enhancement. The influence spread beyond the Iron Curtain. American sports scientists, sensing that something had shifted in Soviet training methods, began their own research into the mind-body connection in athletic performance. The modern understanding of flow states in athletics, the importance of mental training in physical performance, and the concept of neural efficiency all trace their origins back to that October night in a Los Angeles basement. Bruce Lee had unknowingly launched a revolution in sports science simply by demonstrating what was possible when consciousness and physical training reached perfect harmony. Years later, both Viktor and Bruce Lee would reflect on that night differently than the witnesses who saw only the physical confrontation. Viktor would write in his autobiography, published in Russian in 1987, "I came to Los Angeles believing I was fighting a man. I left understanding I had been in the presence of an idea made flesh, the idea that human consciousness has no upper limits." Bruce Lee's private journals, discovered after his death, revealed his own thoughts about the encounter. "Viktor showed me something invaluable. He showed me what pure strength looks like without wisdom. He was a mirror that reflected everything I never wanted to become. Strength without consciousness is a loaded gun in the hands of a child." The night had taught both men that the ultimate human potential isn't found in maximizing any single attribute, strength, speed, or even skill. It's found in achieving perfect integration of all human capacities under the guidance of conscious awareness. In that basement, two approaches to transcending human limitations had met. One sought to exceed biology through chemistry and force. The other sought to exceed biology through understanding and precision. The victor wasn't the stronger man, or even the more skilled fighter. The victor was the approach that recognized human consciousness as the ultimate performance-enhancing drug. This realization would echo through both men's lives and influence how the world understood human potential for generations to come. But this wasn't the only time Bruce Lee would face an opponent who defied conventional understanding of human limitations. 3 years later, in Hong Kong, he would encounter someone even more dangerous than Viktor. Someone who couldn't be stopped by disrupting their nervous system, because they claimed to feel no pain at all.